authorship. It's always a fun topic to talk about and think about, especially, as you all are getting started, Eloisa and Miranda, especially on the comprehensive exam and dissertation, and just sort of in the throes of the doctoral program with your research and presentations and publications and things that you're thinking about. So, it's a topic that we have to, especially if you're thinking about being faculty, you have to concern yourself with, because it just comes along with that, writing the research, the writing the manuscript, and the publications. So hopefully I can share some valuable information for you tonight on authorship and what we sort of the kinds of things that we think about when we're thinking about authorship in our on our publications and projects. So I just quickly will talk about authorship, what it is and why it matters. And the why it matters is going to be more from the lens of a faculty perspective, some ethical considerations, and some really interesting information that came out of a training that I did last week with generative AI. So I want to share that with you. It's kind of indirectly related to authorship and probably more directly related with ethical considerations, but I just found it to be very interesting. So I'll share that. And then talking about what we mean, like when I say criteria for authorship, what are we looking at as far as trying to break down like leadership and responsibilities and accountability and those kinds of things, and how that plays into that authorship ordering. And then I just want to end with talking about some strategies of how to work collaboratively with others as co-authors. So that's what it looks like. So like I, sort of alluded to already about the faculty perspective, we have three big areas of work, right? We have teaching, research, and service. And those are our big responsibilities, along with all the sub or mini responsibilities that go with those major responsibilities. And they're just sort of the key parts of our career in academia. And research is one of those. Even in teaching universities, research and publishing is, while it may not be as high on the ranking, especially towards tenure as it is in research universities, it's still an expectation for tenure track faculty in teaching universities. So we do that for a couple of reasons, but it's mostly to help advance the knowledge in our research areas, but also in the field of social work. And the primary way that our contributions are recognized is through our authorship and that we put on our publications. And so authorship then is usually attributed to a person or persons who are responsible for the intellectual content of a published work. So you may be asking yourself, so why does it matter what order we go in as authors? What does it matter which order the names appear in the list of authors on a publication? And I guess the short answer to that is for some institutions, it does matter, especially when you're talking about tenure. So the higher up on the list, or like if you're looking at first, second, third author, that's what I mean by higher up on the list. When you're looking at that, the name higher up on the list is the one that typically contributes the most significantly to the published work. And they're also the most visible author because they're the first name that appears on the publication, and they're the first name that appears on the citation list for that work. So it's assumed that if your name appears as first author, again, it's because you've had the most significant contributions to the overall manuscript or paper. But then the other thing is that sometimes it matters for tenure. So some institutions on research when they're considering publications for tenure, they want to see a variety of positions of you in those authorship positions. So they want to see you have some sole author publications. They might want to see you as first author with multiple authors on the publication, and they want to see you as second and third author. And that has to do again with that leadership and responsibility and accountable. They want to see accountability. They want to see that you can do it by yourself. They want to see that you can lead a group of researchers, and they want to see that you can follow with and collaborate with other researchers. And for some institutions, that matters for tenure. I don't know that we have that at OLU so much, authorship order, if it truly matters, like if that would keep someone from getting tenure if they didn't have separate separate or different positions of authorship. I don't know about that, but I do know for, you know, my, at least my previous institution, it did matter. And it was considered a teaching institution. It wasn't a research institution, but that was an expectation that you would have multiple positions as far as authorship was concerned. All right, so having multiple authors as in a single publication, I think has become increasingly more popular in previous years. I found these two charts that I thought they were pretty interesting if you stop to look at them. And so the chart on the top shows a 20-year trend of median number of authors on a single publication. And you can see that number has increased from 3 authors in 2002 to 6 in 2012. And it's remained pretty constant at about 6 up until 2021. I haven't looked beyond 2021 to see if anybody else has recorded that. So that's the median number of authors now that we can expect on a publication is about 6. That's what we're looking at. And then the chart on the bottom shows the percentage of single authored publications, and about 36% of publications were single authored in 2003, and now we only have about 2% of our publications in 2021 that are single authored. So there's not a lot of, which I understand it's a lot of work to do all by yourself, a single, you know, the research and the writing and all of that. So I can certainly understand it, but I thought that was very interesting, the numbers, how many single author publications that we see today versus, you know, back when I was slightly before I was getting my PhD. I don't think we even talked about a lot about multiple authors when I was, because I started my PhD program in 2004, and there was not a lot of talk about multiple authors on publications when I was going through my programs. So that's really interesting. I just made that connection between when I started my PhD and what was going on back then. With single authors, it was more common back then. So I think with this uptick in the number of authors being included on the author list of a publication, what we see happening in some journals is that journals are really starting to ask about and sometimes even require you to sign sort of an attestation statement of actual authorship on the publication of everyone who's listed. I was really surprised by that because I had a publication a couple of years ago with another person, and we both had to sign an attestation statement that we truly did contribute equally to. It was just another person and I equally to the publication to be considered authors. So that was really interesting to see that. So I haven't seen it since, but that was something that popped up a couple of years ago for me. So here's the interesting thing that I learned last week in a training using generative AI in the research process. And in that training, there was a faculty from another institution that was attending, and they were talking about a science journal, or he was talking about a science journal that he just recently submitted his manuscript to that required the authors to report on the percentage of generative AI use in the research and manuscript development process in relation to the author's contributions. So the journal was not saying you could not use generative AI to assist in the writing of the manuscript, but you had to report it, the percentage, in relation to everybody else's contribution, which was really, it was kind of odd and really interesting to hear that. So he didn't know. I mean, people were asking, well, what are they going to do with that information? And he didn't know because they didn't disclose what they were doing with that reporting, but that just they had to report it. So I don't know if using generative AI in writing manuscripts for publication might fall into those ethical considerations for authorship. I don't know how they could actually claim that an AI was an author. I mean, you got to feed it information, right? It's not like it just writes it on its own and just butts in on your manuscript. You've got to initiate that contact and what it's writing. But I just found it to be sort of interesting, I think. So I thought I would point it out. So I think we might see more journals starting to bring in portions of generative AI that you have to report on. I don't know to what extent or for what purpose yet, but that might be something to be aware of, especially as you're submitting journal articles or manuscripts to different journals. And I'd be interested in hearing about it if you guys run across that. But which kind of brings me to the other side of the screen, this last box that you see on this slide. And that's some of the common ethical abuses of authorship and publication that we've seen. So what you see here, it's unethical to include an author who may not meet the criteria for authorship, and I'll talk about that criteria in a minute. That is, they simply didn't contribute anything. And yet somehow they've been added as an author on that manuscript. That's unethical to do that. It's also considered unethical for authors to be excluded on a publication who contributed to the writing of the publication. I've experienced that myself. I've heard of that happening to others. And so that's, that's not ethical at all. And then sometimes it happens in academia, senior authors will place themselves as the first author ahead of another author who actually contributed more to the publication, but that's not ethical either. Unless that's the agreement between the authors, that's not an ethical thing to do. So keep that in mind. So if you find yourself in that situation where you have a senior author who's making you do all the work and then they put their name first, that's, that you have an unethical situation you need to address. So this criteria for authorship I've been talking about, let's talk about that for a minute. I think in most cases when we're talking about publications, not always, but often we're talking about we're talking about them in relation to the research studies that we've conducted. And so I thought, well, let's just kind of break this out. If we're thinking about the research process and what that is in relation to criteria for authorship, what does that look like? So there's essentially 5 distinctive activities that we see are associated with the research process that typically culminates into a manuscript for publication. And so the first area is conceptualization, and that's the formation of the idea or the hypothesis. And that can be by a single person, or it could be by a group. A group of you are talking and you start thinking about a project and you start, brainstorming what this would look like. Then we have the planning phase, and that includes, literature searches, the development of the research plans, submitting the IRB application, and then if you need, trying to find funding to conduct the research. Then we have the implementation, which is the actual carrying out of the research study, like recruiting participants and collecting the data, and all of that. And then we have the analysis after that data collection, right? And that includes everything, not just, getting it into SPSS or in vivo, but that's cleaning the data. Sometimes we don't think about that piece, and running the statistical analysis to get the results. And then the last step is the writing of that study into a manuscript and publication. And that includes all the writing up and making all the edits and finding appropriate journals and maybe even submitting the manuscript to a journal. So if we keep this process in mind, then we have to decide what someone's contribution will be to the entire process, of this whole entire process that I just explained, to help determine that authorship order. So there are varying criteria that you can use to help determine this for publication. You might find it surprising that, well, maybe not so surprising, academia very well, that the checklists have been created and actually published to help determine how substantial the contribution is for the criteria. And believe it or not, there's another published checklist that you can use if there's a tie on the first checklist on who should get authorship, or how it's determined that something is a substantial contribution. I know it's academia. It is just a beast all on its own. What can I say? But essentially, what we're looking at when we're talking about the criteria of who should be listed as an author includes these three things that you see on the slide. So you have to ask yourself, have they made a substantial contribution to the design, the data collection, the analysis, and the interpretation of the results? If the answer is yes, then that is a criteria for authorship. They've helped with the drafting of the manuscript, or they are provided a critical review in some way and given feedback, made edits, or something that has to do with the writing of the manuscript and the intellectual content of the publication. That's the second criteria. And the third criteria is that they've given final approval for the publication. So anyone who is listed as an author, regardless of author order, typically has to fulfill all three of these criteria for them to be credibly and ethically listed as an author on a publication. So if you have someone who's helped with the project but didn't necessarily make any contributions to meet the full criteria for authorship, they can be acknowledged, but ethically they shouldn't be listed as an author. So usually there's a way to acknowledge them as a contributor on the manuscript so they can get credit for the work that they did do on the project, but they shouldn't be listed as an author on the publication. All right, let's talk a little bit about authorship order. And so when you're working in a group on a publication, for me, I think it's very important that you begin any work with a group discussing authorship order. And I think it needs to be from the very first meeting, but not just the very first meeting. I think it's a discussion that needs to continue to happen throughout the entire process. So everyone's on the same page, stays on the same page, and remembers what was agreed on about the order of authorship. And it's not uncommon for us to get started on a project with a group and have something about the project sort of shift to the point that you may need to reorder the way you were originally thinking about authorship on the project, because that shift has in some way increased the amounts and kinds of responsibility that someone may need to take on that it may not have been apparent at the beginning of that project. So actually, that just happened recently for Dr. Hawley-Bernardez and I on a project that we've been working on. I think she and I started out as second and fourth authors, and now that's sort of shifted to first and second author. And it's all because of how the responsibility shifted over time as we continue to work on the project. So I think you have to remain flexible and reasonable and considerate of everybody in the group, to make sure that, recognition and acknowledgement of the contributions are made fairly and equitably across the group. So, but I've been a part of some groups where authorship ordering is such an intense process. I haven't found that to be true at OLU and my colleagues that I work with quite frequently on projects. But I've been in the past on other projects where group members had to sign a formal agreement on authorship order. And with that agreement came the details of the responsibilities of each author, and everybody stayed in their lane. The guidelines were clear on who was responsible for what piece of the project, and you just stayed in your lane and did your piece. And then it finally, at one day, it all came together and it was submitted for publication. But, I can say, working with my colleagues at OLU, our groups have been very laid back. We have discussions when things change and shift. We have discussions again and decisions are made. And it's usually, I don't think we've signed anything, have we? Dr. Hawley-Bernardez, I think everything's been a verbal agreement with everybody so far on different projects.
Yeah.
Which I enjoy that much more, because it just gives you a freedom of being able to think and brainstorm and be creative with your projects. So I guess the point is there's really no set way about going about selecting the authorship order. It really depends on the group and the project that you're working on, I think. But here's some, I think maybe some simple suggestions that are pretty widely accepted on what to consider when you're thinking about authorship orders. So with the first author, that should be the person who either contributes the most work to the research, but also to the manuscript itself. That, again, that first author can be seen as a coveted position because it's a position that has the most visibility on the publication itself. But I think it's common practice, and I do this myself a lot. If I'm the senior author, I will put myself last on the publication, regardless of my level of contribution. But, senior authors do that to help support new researchers and get their careers off the ground. I think, it may really depend, and sometimes it depends for me too, on how far down the list I'm willing to put myself. So, if you're looking at where are you at in the tenure process, if I'm coming up on tenure and I need more publications where I'm closer to the top, then I may not be as open to doing that or as willing to do that on everything that I'm doing. I may want to reserve some of that for my tenure. But, if you're full author as a senior author or a full professor as a senior author, it may not matter anymore what position you are because you've reached the highest level of tenure. So, so there's various reasons for why senior authors may or may not want to be, first or last or whatever. But they should always be contributing regardless. They shouldn't just get their name on the publications. So I think it's also common to have a senior author be listed as first author on the publication when their sole responsibility responsibility is writing the manuscript after students or a newer author has completed the study. And that's usually, again, in conversations and agreement, in that sometimes it's because the student author, the new researcher hasn't sharpened their academic writing skills to the level of a senior author. So that writing of the manuscript would be important in getting that publication. So in that case, the senior authors made a significant contribution by writing the full manuscript, and the student or new researcher has also made significant contributions in carrying out the research and analyzing the data. But again, I think this is where those conversations at the beginning of the project really become important, to make sure everybody is on the same page and in agreement about what authorship order should go on the manuscript. And then we have, authors in between the first and the last. What if you're not first, but you're not last? How is that decided? And I think that's, sometimes it's decided by, if you're the senior person in the group, but you don't want to be last, you don't necessarily want to be first, maybe that person gets to be second because they're the senior author in the group. Or it could be degree of difficulty of task that each person's carried out that determines who's second or third. So, typically the more difficult the task, the higher order of the authorship. So let's see, next slide. Okay, so I think it goes without saying we all have probably worked in groups that didn't go particularly well, but hopefully you've been able to work in groups that have gone well. I've experienced both. Groups that go well are much better than groups that don't go well, a lot less stressful, but I think it helps with the success of a group, especially if you've not worked together much, which may be the case for you with your cohorts. You haven't worked together much, you don't know each other that well. But when that happens, I think it's, the group needs to take time to discuss, guiding values and principles of the group that they're going to follow when they're working together. So I found this really great graphic here that you see on the screen. It's by Oliver et al. And it was published in 2018, and it discusses some guiding principles for group work that I think, at least for me, align with my own guiding principles when I work in a group. And I thought I'd just share these with you as some food for thought, if you will, about working collaboratively on manuscripts and deciding about authorship order. So as you see on the graphic, Oliver sort of highlights these guiding principles like transparency and inclusion and fairness, and protection and promotion, accountability, efficiency and productivity, and creativity. And then next to the guiding principles, you see some of the best practices for working collaboratively in a group. So thinking about the guiding principles for me, I think transparency, it's at the top of his list, but I think it's also at the top of my list too, because I think it's very important for everyone to be upfront and honest when they're working in a group about their time availability to work on the project, their levels of confidence in completing various parts of a project, and just being honest when things aren't working out or if you get stuck on something. I also think it's important to be inclusive in communication about the project to those that are a part of the group, and fair in who is assigned what task, and even deciding that authorship order for the project. And so the next guiding value you see is that of protection and promotion. And to me, whoever has the idea for the project, I think they should have the most say in how the project goes and the authorship order. But at the same time, because it is their idea and sort of their vision, I think that person tends to take on more of the responsibilities and some of the difficult tasks of the project. So, when someone approaches me about working with them, I have no problem whatsoever with them being first author, because it's their idea and it's their vision, and they know how they want to put together and what they want to do with the project. So So that's important to me, to protect others' ideas and promote others who have brought up the idea or developing the idea, even if I'm collaborating with them. So I love collaborating with others. I think there's such a dynamic and synergy in that process of collaboration. It just really energizes me. But, I think at the same time, it's important for everyone in the group to hold each other accountable for the quality of the work, and the timeliness in which things are being completed, because sometimes some of us work faster than others. Things happen, but again, that constant communication and, working together collaboratively, sometimes I can't get things done as fast because I have something going on and somebody else may step up and do that, but I, in turn, will do that for them as well. So, um, you know, group work is an interesting thing. I've been in it where individuals just don't pull their weight and they're not held accountable for that. But I've also been in it where I've had to take up the slack or others have had to take up the slack. And I think the most unfortunate part of that, and I don't know if you've been a part of that, but they get to continue as if they've contributed and they get their name on the project or their name as author or whatever. But I think, when we're talking about that and when we're doing that in the process of that, I think all of that goes back to that transparency and fairness principles that we need to keep that in the forefront and have the courage. I don't always have the courage to say something, but I think, having that courage to step up and say, let's be transparent about what's happened here and be fair with what's happened here. So the next two principles are efficiency and productivity, which to me just go hand in hand. So when the project is, and this is important to me, well organized and there's clear timelines for getting things done. And I think everyone in the group, when that happens, can actually be productive and work efficiently toward our common goal of getting the manuscript published, right? And I think the same thing for creativity. I don't think having roles and responsibilities and organization on projects stifle creativity in the group. I think it's what I like the most about collaborating with others is that when you brainstorm and think through the ideas and the possibilities of the project, that creativity that sort of flows from all of that. So, but that doesn't mean, again, that you can't be organized and efficient and have clear timelines. All right, so the last piece here is the best practices for collaboration. So once you get the guiding principles established with the group, I think you can begin understanding sort of the dynamics and each individual strengths and the challenges, especially in relation to the project. And so when you are the authorship, when you're talking about authorship order, it can create some conflicts, I think. And that's why I think it's important to have those co-authorship policies or conversations in place that kind of help keep those conflicts down and keep everybody on the same page about how the group will work and who will take on what responsibilities. I think that's a part of that collaborative process. Now, like I mentioned before, to protect new ideas, I think the person who has the idea about a manuscript is often the one who will seek out others to work with them on a project. So they're typically the one who decides the type of manuscript that will be written to. So the one with the idea is the one who decides if this is going to be a research project, if it's going to be a conceptual piece or a theoretical paper. But again, it's also the person who helps decide how authorship will be given. And that's not to say that it's done in isolation with that person, but I think that person with the idea holds a lot of weight in the decisions of who's going to work in the group, who those authors are going to be, what that work looks like, and who gets what authorship order. And then finally, just having open dialogues at the beginning of the project again, as well as throughout the project with all the co-authors about the work that's being done is essential. So if someone gets stuck and needs help, brainstorming ideas, finding resources, creatively problem solving. It just helps keep the project running smoothly for everybody. And so, again, I think to me, maybe the message is remaining flexible. That's the most important point, because we have to be flexible. We have the best intentions when we start, but things don't always unfold in the way that we envision or the way that we think they will. So we have to be flexible in case that authorship order changes, and the needs change as the project progresses. So that is all I have. That was really quick. That wasn't quite an hour, was it?
I think that's fine. I think this was some great information. And you may, I was putting a child to bed, but you may have touched on this a little bit. But did you talk about like changing of authorship order at all? Okay.
I was just telling them, we recently ran into that as the project changes and responsibilities and tasks have changed on the project, then just, that flexibility, that transparency of having open conversations about, this has happened, this is where we're at, this is what we need to do to get it move to the next level.
Right.
And so sometimes that means the authorship order will change. So,
And just reevaluating.
mhm.
Mhm. What has
And
been
it's I mean, I think it's a hard conversation. It is for me because I don't want to be misunderstood. I
yeah.
think that, I'm not trying to take over a project or demand something, but it can be kind of an uncomfortable conversation, even if you know people well, right?
Yeah,
Like
and I
to me
think it's
it is.
advocating for yourself. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that just is a process and a skill that you have to learn to advocate for yourself. So,
Right.
have any of you guys experienced talking about authorship order or anything like that so far?
I think it's,
You know,
yeah.
Eloisa, I was going to say Eloisa's in the scholarly writing and publishing class right now, so I don't know if you guys.
Yeah, so we actually talked about authorship last semester because um the assignment we're working on is our mixed methods. So we had talked about authorship like right at the beginning when we started writing, like who's gonna be first, second, third, fourth. So we did all that. And I know me and you, Dr. Holly, like we've even talked about because we're working on hopefully if it goes through soon, our project together and then so discussing that. So it can be actually a pretty easy conversation if you come straightforward, like you come out it neutral area, like, okay, who wants to do what, who's going to take what responsibilities, and what's the order going to be, and how much, for me, I like leadership where it's like, this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to do, and you're going to do this, but also taking that initiative too. But yeah, I always talk about authorship. That's been my role. Talk about it right away to get it out of the way and kind of keep that conversation going too.
And I think it just sets expectations
Mhm.
for like who's going to take on what roles. Um, and I think that kind of gives a clearer picture of who's going to be doing what. There was something else I was going to say, but now I can't remember.
I think Miranda, I don't know if I cut you off. I'm sorry. I just thought Eloise. I knew Eloise, and Carla too is in the scholarly writing class. But were you going to say something about authorship?
Yeah, I mean, I do think some of these conversations are hard because I think I just expect, like, if you have the conversation up front and you're like, okay, you're going to do this, this is kind of going to be the author order based on the amount of work you do. I understand that it has to change. And I think I expect people to come forward and say, like, hey, I know I'm not doing as much. I will take a step back for authorship rather than me having to say, like, hey, I'm doing more. Like, I absolutely, I think we need to advocate for ourselves, but I think we also need to recognize, like, my life is getting busy right now. I need to take a step back from this project. I can still work on it, but I'll take last authorship. Like, I wish more people would do that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
And I think you will find, at least this is my experience, like I feel very comfortable doing that because I have tenure now. And so I think you'll find that it really depends on the type of person, their position. Um, I think, I remembered what I was going to say. I think this does sometimes become more of a problem at more R1 type universities where it's, authorship order is, I don't know how to describe it. What I'm trying to say is just like,
They're cutthroat.
yes, yes. It's almost cutthroat, and people that have positions of power over students can sometimes manipulate that in a way to their benefit and, use students in a way. And so really setting expectations from the very beginning is very important. And really knowing the team that you want to work with, and making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page, and being very strategic about the team that you select, I think is also important.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right. It's like why we find the same author. Like when I'm looking in perinatal mental health, it's like the same like group set of authors over and over. And sometimes it'll be that duo with a couple more people, or that duo with one other person, or just that duo. Yeah. I'm like, they work well together,
Yeah.
apparently.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's important. And I mean, sometimes you don't know, right? But that's how you learn. It's
Mhm.
kind of like, I was trying to remember what my dad said, something like you don't ever really know a person until you live with them or you work with them.
Pretty good saying.
And so if you think you might know them, you start working with them, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But then, you finish up, do the best you can, and then make different choices next time. That's all I know to do. But yeah, being careful to select people that you work well together with. And sometimes that's work style, right? Sometimes we don't understand each other's work style, and so that can be frustrating. We talk a little bit about that, especially when we're talking about selecting chairs for a comprehensive exam or dissertation. The work style becomes very important. So what your expectations are for work and what the other person's expectations are for work, how you work and how you produce things, sometimes can be frustrating if you're not on the same page. So
Well, and
I
I
think
think
it's true.
again at different universities, I have not experienced this at OLU, but I have experienced it kind of at other places, and I've seen it witnessed at other places. It's just it becomes a power. It becomes about exerting power and like who has the prestige kind of thing. I mean, it's a different ball game. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Are there any questions at all or anything? Okay. So get out there and negotiate your authorship order. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Patton. I really appreciate you coming to do this talk, and
Thanks for
I'm glad
having
I recorded it. So hopefully, I know there's usually a few people that always ask for the recording. So, um, and if you guys have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and ask away. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you. It's great to see you.
Bye. Thanks, Carla.
Bye. Thank you.